everybody. Welcome back. I am Emily Moyer. Howdie McCoskey and Michael Wan are here. This is the Real Trilateral Commission number 3. And today's is going to be a shit show of a humdinger or something, right? Like this one, I'll be honest with you. This one was incredibly challenging for me. It's my turn to pick the topic, right? Let me tell you about that mess after I say hello to my friends here. Howdy, Michael. How you guys doing?
I am doing very well. I greatly look forward to this conversation. And if this is the 3rd episode of the Real Trilateral, we've got a 33 going on here, and it's going to fit into my storyline. That's a little foreshadowing for those who are keeping score at home.
All right. Got to make everything a fucking about score, huh? I see how you are. And Howdy, you doing all right there?
Yeah, like I was saying, it's planting time, so busy on the farm, and I've just got a few things to talk about, and I'm going to see what you guys bring up, so I decide what is shared or not shared.
All right, so.
Very mysterious. I like that, because now we're all going to be wondering, what did he not share? What else is going on that we haven't been privileged to hear?
All right, so this was my turn to pick the topic. And I was feeling a lot of pressure and fear about, what if there's not a good story? And then, of course, then when the day comes up for me to pick, like the news, all of my standard sites that I go to and we kind of, want to work within what we usually look at, they were just completely overrun with Gaza-Israel propaganda or vaccine propaganda. So there was very few like weird stories. Right. And I actually want to thank producer Laura over here for helping to steer me towards one that might be interesting. I did see it pop up in my feed, but I'm going to be 100% honest here. I had never heard of Bob Ross until the other day. Now, that doesn't mean I don't know who Bob Ross is, but the name Bob Ross didn't ring any bells for me. Once I saw his picture, all the stuff kind of came on back. So the article that I picked as my starting point for this was this article that it was on Yahoo News, but it's originally from the Daily Beast. And it's titled Sex, Deceit, and Scandal, The Ugly War Over Bob Ross's Ghost. And I'm going to be honest here, like this is probably going to be like not the most organized presentation I've ever done because there's just so much in this story that like it's a long article. I didn't know where to start, what was more important than something else. So it's just going to kind of be like a dump of my thoughts and things that kind of came. And so that's what this is. All right. So Bob Ross was the painting guy on PBS. For people who don't know who Bob Ross is, he was like the guy with the weird perm who painted the same painting every week on PBS, and people tuned into that, I guess, was kind of the story. So this article is really interesting, and it's talking about how Bob Ross is sort of having a revival right now through like the influencer generation. And if you really think about Bob Ross, like he's a meme, he's like the meme fantasy, like the fantasy meme, right? He's like the perfect meme. And, you know this because he's been, he's been referred to a lot on Instagram in the Deadpool comics. And then there was this very weird sentence in like one of the opening paragraphs that says he was satirized by Jim Carrey as Joe Biden. Right. So then I was like, there's a lot of sentences in this article that don't make sense. But that was the first one that really caught me. And like, this is completely fake. This is a fake story. This is a fake person, right? And then it said he's also in a new Mountain Dew CGI commercial. They were very clear to let us know that the commercial was CGI. So my mind started going to, is Bob Ross like some earlier version, some earlier iteration of CGI? Now, for myself, like when I would see this stuff on PBS when I was a kid, right? Because he was inserted right between the mind control programming for children, like the daytime stuff, like Sesame Street and all that kind of stuff, and the PBS evening news, which is the mind control for intellectuals who think that they've escaped Operation Mockingbird by watching PBS, right? But they haven't. And he was kind of inserted in that in-between point. So when my shows were coming to an end, Like you'd see this thing come on, and like in my 6-year-old, 7-year-old, 8-year-old brain, I was already thinking like, this can't be real. This has to be, this guy can't be for real. What the fuck is this shit? I didn't watch the show, but I would see him in the way he talked and the way he looked. And it was like, you know, for a 6-year-old in the 70s or 80s to be able to conceptualize what we now think of as a meme, that was what my mind was doing. Like, this can't fucking be real, right? But apparently it was, right? So anywho, so I'm immediately starting to think that like, okay, this whole thing is fake, like this, right? This article is pretty interesting. It's incredibly lengthy, as are all of the articles about Bob Ross are basically either so long that it's almost an off-putting to read them, or so short that you're like, was that just like a mind control trigger statement? Like a paragraph full of weird words is like some sort of mind control thing. I'll get to that in a bit. But anyway, so I start digging in. And like the point of this article seems to be to like make Bob Ross out to be just some soft, sweet guy. And then there's these really nasty Kowalskis that are money grubbing, money hungry people who will like chase a man into his grave for his name, right? And it also is not lost on me that this is the second time this week that Michael and I will have been talking about somebody who was fighting for their name, right? And in the case of Tina Turner, right, she was fighting for a name that wasn't actually even hers, which makes me wonder if Bob Ross is his name or not actually to begin with as well, right? So the article is largely focused on how nasty the Kowalskis were. And then this character, Stephen Ross, who's Bob Ross's son, is sort of this like weird hero who's just a guy who's had a hard life, but in the end, even though he lost control over his dad's name and this and that, he's still allowed to do painting workshops and get appreciated by people. It's like the weirdest fucking story. But sandwiched in there are like the items that are glossed over that should be the main point, right? Like the fact that Bob Ross was a sergeant in the Air Force, a master sergeant in the Air Force, that the person who was his predecessor is being like the famous TV painter was a fucking Nazi. Reluctantly, as they say he was a Nazi, right? That the people that he ended up in business with were the husband, Walt Kowalski, was a retired CIA agent. That's an oxymoron to begin with. I don't know if there's such a thing as a retired CIA agent, but these things were all like just little novelties of the story, like not the main point. There was also very brushed over the fact that like he lived in all these random places without any explanation as to why. Like they tossed in at the end, oh yeah, he was known to have affairs without any real explanation of that, right? There was all this just sort of weird stuff compiled in the story, almost like they were just like putting information together. Like it was almost like they made up this story that were focused on Kowalskis and their money grubbing as a place to hide all of this other sort of information dump. I don't know. It was a really weird story. So so if you search for, well, the case is supposedly about intellectual property and owning the corporate image of someone else, right? And you can go into all sorts of stuff with this. Like we hear all the time that like our names, all capital letters, are corporations and we're owned and they can do things under our name and whatnot. And this seems to be an example of this, right? The fight seems to be over his name. And if they can claim that anything that was done under that name belongs to them, like it's being made over like money and stuff, but this wasn't even a lot of money going around in this situation. Like when they're talking about how much money he's making at the height of his career, he was making $180,000 a year. And even with all of his products, it's only in the millions. It's not even in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, or billions. It's like 1.4 million, 4.5 million, which yeah, to me, that's a lot of money. But to have all this crazy stuff going on around it, it seems like this is a cover for something else, right? So the entire purpose was really, to me, once I got to the bottom of this article, was actually about destroying the audio tapes. There was these audio tapes that are referred to that were as part of the deal that was struck in the final court case, that these audio tapes would be destroyed. And I would say that this is the evidence that Bob Ross is a created entity. It is a corporation, and at various times, you know, I don't even know if it was always necessarily played by the same person. And I think we're seeing that in a lot of ways now with other things going on in the world, right? But the undertone is Bob Ross's son in this story of quote unquote grand theft Bob, right? So we have the nasty Kowalskis and their litigious stuff fighting over intellectual property and owning his name. We have the hero of the story, sort of Stephen, who's able to now do painting lessons and get compliments from people online. And then this idea of grand theft Bob, right? And, you know, we're familiar with Grand Theft Auto being like a virtual reality game or an augmenting reality game. I thought that was kind of an interesting comparison. So there's this focus on the Kowalskis as nasty people. The most important thing about the Kowalskis is glossed over, and that's that Kowalski was a CIA agent. If you do a search for Walt Kowalski online, what you come up with is a character from a fake character from a movie called Gran Torino by Clint Eastwood, where that Clint Eastwood played Walt Kowalski, right? So there's no Wikipedia entrance on this guy, on the person that is Walt Kowalski of the Bob Ross story fame, right? There is only Clint Eastwood and Gran Torino and saying that it's a fake character. And if you go and look into the amount of stuff that's been written online about the Walt Kowalski fake character in Gran Torino, it's immense. Like I was able to find like the most informative like article or blog post about it was like 30, 40 pages long. That's an awful lot to write about a fake character, right? So to me, in my head, this is like an amalgam. This is the same person. There is some crossover between this Walt Kowalski and the Walt Kowalski in Gran Torino that Clint Eastwood played. And supposedly the fake character Walt Kowalski and real Clint Eastwood both were Korean War vets, right? So that's the tie between the two of them. And then there's almost nothing you can find about this Walt Kowalski unless you search his name with Annette. If you look up Annette and Walt Kowalski, you get a little bit of reference to this guy, but not much, right? So like this person's identity or background is really well hidden, which I thought was kind of interesting, right? And there's also not much discussed about Bob Ross's history as a sergeant in the Air Force or Bill Sullivan's time as a Nazi. There's a little bit in there, but it's mostly like talking about his reluctance about it and how he became a prisoner of war and how he ended up immigrating to Canada based on that and whatnot. But to me, it's just like, all right, so Bill Alexander, so I think I said Bill Sullivan. Bill Alexander is a Nazi propagandist. Bob Ross is his understudy, right? Who then sort of becomes the disseminator of this sort of style of like NLP that is like a mind control program for a certain level, but also the way he travels around, it's like a multi-level mind control operation, right? Where by moving around from place to place and doing all these workshops, a lot of information can be exchanged, money can be exchanged, right? Like it doesn't seem like he made that much money, but there seems to be this fight over like receipts and all of this crazy shit. Like, I don't know what the hell this is that I'm looking at, but it seems like a perfect operation for, you know, some kind of mind control, something or other. I'm not quite sure. Let's see. It's like, there's this like interesting thing that comes up in the beginning and then again at the end is that Bob Ross has a single father of a son, right? And there's not really too much gone into about that turns out to be this Stephen at the end. There's not much made about it. At the end, it also talks about how Bob was known to sleep around and have affairs, right? Everything that's presented as painting to me is a cover for something else, right? Like, you know, people would go and sit in these workshops, people would watch the show, and there'd be all these like words, like these happy little this and squirrels that, which were actually terms that he took from Bill Alexander, but Bill Alexander had a different tone with it. And Bob Ross took it into this like hypnotic state, right? That just, I mean, do you guys familiar with like the tone of voice that you hear on PBS and NPR, right? Where it's like, why does everybody sound the same? Right. And then there's a group of people that listen to that information that think that they're like not as mind controlled as the people who watch mainstream stuff. And they think they're intellectual and they're under this sort of hypnotic NLP kind of tone. And this seems to be like where a lot of that like came in, right? All right, so just a second. There's this, okay, so there's a technique that is called the Alexander technique. That is the painting technique, supposedly. And that he came up with it, but Bob perfected it with the performative element, right? And so, you know, it kind of moved like the way, like the Bill Alexander commanded what he was doing, whereas Bob Ross sort of slipped it in, right? And if you think about it, that was a big change in that period of time, from like the 50s and 60s to the 70s and 80s. And Michael, you and I have cataloged that with the way we're talking about like MK Ultra 2.0 or 3.0 versus 1.0, right? And this was right in that same period of time, right? Where things slipped from something that was like harsh and direct to something that was more sort of slipped in and not as direct. All right. I have a lot of questions about the wife, Annette, being like the handler of Walt, who was the handler of Bob, right? She seems, you know, like that there's not a lot of information available about her either, but the story is that she went to one of his workshops and discovered him. And then, you know, they set up this whole thing, and that the ex-CIA agent Walt was bored, so decided that setting up these tours was a good idea. Like, do you really know that? I mean, it's bizarre to me that this many ex-military or Nazi kind of people or CIA, ex-CIA agents, like this is what they want to do with their extra time, was like, let's all be painters and set up painting tours and whatever. Like, it's just a story that doesn't make sense. Let's see. So as I'm like digging into some of this, I started looking up Bob Ross, right? So I've read this article. This is like the only thing I've ever read about Bob Ross. So I go looking to see like what else I can find about him, right? And the first thing I find is this strange, like just, it's a post on a gun sharing board or something, like an AR15.com, where people in the gun community are questioning whether his little phrases, like it says here, like it emerged over time that Bob Ross Inc. is run by Bob's business partners, including Mr. Walt Kowalski, who's a retired from CIA shortly before his wife discovered Ross in the TV show and the phenomenon began. And there's a few little stuff about in there, but it basically says, given the hypnotic, mildly psychedelic nature of a Bob Ross program and even a tangential connection to the agency, I think we need to run this one to the ground, right? And it suggested was the term happy little accident, which apparently he says in almost every show, the go word for MK and MK Ultra agents somewhere, right? And I thought that was kind of an interesting thought. So, okay, like that's kind of went with what I was thinking. But then I started digging around and I found this very weird article. And this is where I guess it starts to get weirder. Laura, I'm gonna have to open it on Laura's computer because Washington Post won't let me open more than one article. So there was an article in the Washington Post last year, right, in April, just after the lockdowns and stuff had begun. And this was in the Washington Post, and it said, nothing brought more joy to the joy of painting's Bob Ross than squirrels, all right? And it's this really weird article about Bob Ross and his little squirrel pea pod, his pocket squirrel, that everybody seemed to know about and he would make reference to all the time, but he never actually painted, right? And there was even like something in there that sounded like, okay, this is the opening sentence to the article. Little things made Bob Ross happy. Little clouds made the landscape artist happy. Little trees made him happy, and little squirrels made him happy. Little squirrels like pea pod. That's the opening of an article in the Washington Post from April 2020. All right. It goes on to detail like a little bit about Bob Ross, but no mention of any of this, you know, more weird stuff. About April of last year, my father became obsessed with squirrels. My father is he consumes PBS and things like that at an absolutely alarming rate. That's where he gets his news. He's watched that stuff from the time I was a kid. And once we went on lockdown last year, I started getting texts every day and messages and conversations with him about this squirrel in the backyard that my dad had nicknamed Borat. And my dad sends me pictures of the squirrel. And my dad, like the things that are talked about in this article, and I'll include it in the show notes, is like there would be arguments about who was going to eat the walnut, right? Bob or the squirrel. And his squirrel's name was Peapod. Well, my dad would tell me, Borat took my nuts. I had some almonds and Borat took them. Like that has been the main content of like his texts and our conversations for the last year in some ways, has been these two squirrels in the backyard, Borat and Melville, right? And so I'm like, what the fuck kind of mind control program is this? My father reads the Washington Post, right? Like I'm not saying this is even entertaining to listen to what I'm talking about right now, right? But I don't like, this is crazy. This is like some kind of like recessed level of mind control that is weird. And like, we're looking for, you know, Bob Ross doesn't work on me, but apparently Bob Ross works on my dad, because my dad right now has spent the last year, when there's plenty of other things to be concerned with, focused on squirrels. He's perfectly content to sit in, this is a person who used to travel the world, and now he's content to sit in his backyard and play with squirrels and argue over almonds and nuts with the squirrels, right? So I'm like, all right, this is weird. So I start doing a little bit more research. And then I'm like, you know who Bob Ross reminds me of? Bob Ross reminds me of Richard Simmons, right? They have the same fucking hair, right? And it turns out that both Bob Ross and Richard Simmons have had chia pets made about them, right? I'm like, okay, this is weird. Like chia pets were like memes before there were memes. Like if something was made into a chia pet, like that was like, you know, that was a kind of thing. So I'm like, these two are kind of similar, right? And so I go digging around to see if I can find any information on Bob Ross and Richard Simmons connection, right? And they're from the same time period, that 70s, 80s kind of time period. And what I found was a very interesting post on Twitter from somebody named Non-Fungible Tom Tomorrow. Right? So we've been hearing a lot about non-fungible tokens the last few months, but this is from back last November, this post, and it says, the Richard Simmons and Bob Ross Chia Pet commercial feels a little too self-aware for my nuanced appreciation of kitsch. And I was like, that's an interesting statement, right? Like, I don't know what to make of it, but that's interesting. And then he says, fun fact though, I used to have a gig word processing at a place in San Francisco a million years ago. And one of the things I spent a lot of time typing was scripts for Richard Simmons' exercise shows. You'd think they were all ad-lib, but you would be very wrong about that, right? So like, okay, and so then the same thing, obviously, with the Bob Ross painting shows. These are things that are made to be just like guys in their living room doing their thing, like having fun, off the cuff kind of stuff. They're totally scripted. Right? Which is not surprising to either of us, but I thought that was kind of a funny statement just last November that this is becoming a thing again. And then the next thing I find, and this one is like, I don't even know what to make of this. This is pretty weird, right? So, all right, let me read you this article first. Like this is totally out of order. I get this, but this is how this article went to me. There's an interesting paragraph in this article that I think is the point of the whole article. Right? The Kowalskis had married young and started a family in short order with 5 kids in only 9 years. Walt worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, and those who know him said he sometimes told tales from his time in the agency, from a gaudy anecdote about eating monkey brains with the Viet Cong to taking a Cold War victory lap around the Kremlin on a work trip with Bob many years later. According to those same people, Walt's defining feature, what jumped out immediately upon meeting him, were his eyes that were cold and calculating, shark's eyes, and shark's eyes. Okay, first of all, there had been no discussion before about Kowalski being in Vietnam or whatever, right? But it says here, taking a Cold War victory lap around the Kremlin on a work trip with Bob many years later. Wait a second, I thought he met Bob after he was done with the CIA, right? So it says here, he would tell tales from his time in the agency, right? Okay, so here it says that Bob and him, what were they doing in the Kremlin? I thought all of the painting workshops were on the East Coast, right? Going around, what were they doing at the Kremlin? Taking victory laps? This is a propaganda thing. Like, what the fuck is going on? So everything is scripted. And then there's this, and I don't know what this fucking means, but I found this when I was searching for Richard Simmons and Bob Ross together. All right. So This is from something called Stab on Instagram. If Bob Ross and Richard Simmons had a baby, the resulting fitness artist still couldn't paint the sky with this flamboyant panache, but his afro would win many awards. At Ian Crane's trademark backside Staley flies, early and often in his new film Beachhead, there's a hot link in our bio, right? So I guess there's a surfer named Ian Crane. But what's funny about this to me is that didn't somebody also who used to be in the alternative media die named Ian Crane, right? Ian Crane used to work for oil companies and then became an activist. There's been some questions about his role in the alternative media from some people who are suspicious of things he talks about and doesn't talk about. Like, I don't even know how I ended up here. But this, if you look at this, you see the shark's fins, right? So this paragraph here is talking about Walt Kowalski's shark's eyes. And then I end up down like a rabbit hole where I'm now in the ocean, right? With this guy, you know, we hear about sharks and surfing, and the surfboard looks kind of like a shark. I'm not saying there's any, I don't know what this is. Like, I almost feel bad because I feel my presentation is all over the place today, but this is what this article did. Like, what are we looking at here? What is Bob Ross? Who is Bob Ross? Is this even like a person, or is this like, you know how is this just a corporation that had all this activity going on underneath it? And there happened to be a person associated with who may or may not have been Bob Ross, but this entire corporation like was a front for like Mockingbird type of operation at PBS, but also like being able to be in certain places and exchange, you know, like this was having lots of different people coming to these painting workshops, right? Like, you know, people exchanging information, a lot of housewives, right? When we look at like the old school sort of model of MK Ultra, or in the 50s, you have like the secretary being the one who like the agent comes in and hypnotizes her, gives her the phrase, somebody else comes in, pulls the phrase out, kind of stuff. Like, think about that all could have been going on. Like, a CIA agent's wife discovers him at the workshop, and then they decide that this is the most effective way for him to spend his retired years, is moving around with these workshops everywhere under the guise of the painting, right? And then there's this whole weird stuff with like the actual paints, right? Like that they changed it from magic white to liquid white, and that the white base was what made all of these paintings like, you know, magical and whatever. I don't know what this is. Like, it almost feels like even the way that they talk about paints and the painting tools is actually code for like implanting certain features of mind control. Like, I don't even know. This feels like a mess to me. Like, I usually like a much more cohesive narrative, but like, this is the truth of all the things that were brought up for me. And I was explaining to Howdie before we got started here today that like information, I feel overwhelmed by it right now and hard to make sort of like a cohesive narrative about it. Like, in my own head, like I can see like a very clear map of what was going on here, but trying to explain it to someone feels and sounds crazy. So I'm going to stop right now because that felt incredibly messy to me, but I'm left with far more questions than I am answers. Anybody feel free to respond.
May I go first?
Please.
All right. First off, I didn't think it was a disorganized presentation. Particularly in the beginning. The beginning was really, really, really tight. And maybe what happened, I think this might even be the nature of these presentations, is like in the beginning, you get like my mind starts going right there. And then like I'm holding on to those ideas. So I was more focused or more aware of like some of the stuff which you brought up in the beginning. And I thought was, I want to make some comments on that. First thing is I'm in total agreement with you about the role of the programming as programming, and your observation of the show coming between like, you know, Sesame Street and that news hour, and like his monotone, happy SSRI type of like NLP, like it's taking Prozac. So you put it in context for what was out there. It kind of like prepares you to go into, the all spun up from Sesame Street and the electric company. And now we're going to go and bring you, into the news. And now we're going to go implant. And you're really interested. You really struck a chord with me when you're describing like, who does watch PBS, like, and that entire sort of like generality of that group. But what I want to say though, I want to include this is your comment about you went to go look in the news and to pick the article, and everything was either like vaccination or Gaza, vax or Gaz. Like, it's got kind of that, the Z and the A was jumping out at me, except for this one story. And this one story, like, kind of was like the shining light, like, oh, if you're fed up with that, here, get this. And, it was like set up for it. And you're absolutely right in the fact that the article was like, it wasn't easy to read. It was 12,000 words. It was a long article, and it was a totally different type of propaganda. So I think that fits in with it very well. One comment about like with the money issue as it relates, because you're right, it wasn't big dollars that were involved, but what makes sense is who is going to connect with that number. So it is meant to connect with someone who is in that demographic where that would be considered like an accessible income. So think about that. So like that's the link with that. And the last thing I want to say is you did the link with Richard Simmons, and I love the CGI thing. Like, oh yeah, that's really interesting. But as you were describing Bob Ross and you're describing like the show, what was jumping out to me was Chuck Barris. And so if you go and you look at that in terms of whether it's and in terms of like in the shows come with it like actual code words, particularly like, if you think about who's watching the show, but like Chuck Barris being like a different flavor of the same ice cream, like, he's all spun up and wild and out of control. And this is like really, really smooth. And also looking at the time frames in terms of, well, two things, like, would the same person be watching both Chuck Barris, the Gong Show and Bob Ross when they were in their prime? And, my guess would be not, but there was also there was like a gap. The Gong Show was taken out of, what do you call it? Syndication in 1980. And The Joy of Painting began in 1983. So there was like this window, and particularly when you think about it, like in terms of managing populations, that, if you go and I would be curious to look at like that population, probably the baby boomer, like where did they switch? From that time period? So that I thought was interesting. Overall, fascinating story. And I'm excited to get into my analysis once we hear Howdie's insightful commentary.
Okay, let me just respond to you real quick on a couple of things. Like when we get to like the CGI thing, like what is the saying? Like by the time that we're clear on something, like it's 50-year-old technology, like by the time it's released to us, right? So like, I think like when it became clear to us that we were looking at a lot of CGI stuff was when they showed us that Tupac Shakur performing at, I think was at Coachella. And then also like with some of the anomalies around the Edward Snowden case and some of the strange ways that he looked, like that was when we moved into this like era of like talking about CGI and deep fake, right? But if you count back from there 30, 40 years, like Bob Ross is right in there. My guess would be that like there's some element of CGI that was already at play here that we were not understanding, right? And there's not a lot of pictures of Bob Ross from at least not included in the articles of him from these workshops, right? So we're not even 100% sure that it's always the same exact person that was going around doing these workshops, right? There's one thing being presented on TV, and then there's like multiple people who can play that role, kind of like when like Broadway show goes on tour, somebody plays the role in Los Angeles, somebody plays it somewhere else. So that kind of thing. And then your thing about Chuck Barris is interesting because that one comes up for me. It was coming up for me when I think about that. Also, Julia Childs and her connection to intelligence stuff. People often talk about like Rachel Ray having, connections to intelligence kind of stuff. But this isn't that far also out of the frame of like what you and I have been talking about in terms of like Deborah Harry and her world touring and her possibly being some kind of agent and whatnot. It's a different demographic that she would appeal to than Bob Ross or Chuck Barris, The Gong Show, but they have to have versions of these for everybody. And they have to have them domestically and they have to have them internationally and that kind of thing, right? So anyway, yeah, Chuck Barris for sure, that comes up. All right, Howdie.
Yeah, I'll keep it short so we can move on. I thought it was a pretty good presentation, actually, Emily. I thought it was really well done, and because there's a lot of detail about. I could, Michael's gonna laugh, but I did watch The Gong Show in the 1970s, and I did watch The Joy of Painting in the 1980s. For me, it came on Saturday mornings about 10:30, and I watched it after a fishing show, and then I would watch every day, every Saturday. That was a standard. I watched the half-hour Bob Ross painting show. Not because I wanted to learn how to paint, and not because I was trying to get some ASMR weird tingling sensation, but just because it was fascinating to see the time frame that something could be created on a daily basis. But I'll bring in two pieces of information that from what I've heard, and then I'll stop. The first was one of the last things Emily just said in the final comments here, and that was talking about playing a role. Where if you have a potential TV character, and the more you place the TV or whoever you want to play a role in, like in one of Carlos Castaneda books, he does this thing with tupelos, right? This thing where they're multiple. The idea is that you give them certain characteristics. So if you move to another person with similar characteristics, you would never think it's two different people, because there's certain things that are so unique to that one character that as soon as you see someone else doing the same thing, it must be that person. So that was the first thing I thought of. It'd be so easy then with someone with the big afro and the kind of comments, I'm painting happy little trees. And you hear that, it's Bob Ross, right?
Yeah.
The second thing would be is that I'll see where Michael goes with this. But of course, because I watch Bob Ross, I looked into the Bob Ross story years ago. I mean, I was curious about him. And the whole story between him and Bill Alexander is really strange. Particularly if you watch Bill Alexander's show, because Bill had a show in the 70s before Bob had his. The Bob Ross show is an almost exact copy. It's like the show is set up the same way. The palette is in the same place. Bill is in the same place. The camera angle's in the same place. And even the language is the same, other than Bill talks with a more direct kind of sort of, but it was still encouragement. Everything Bill was doing was encouraging, just was in a but he used the same words, happy little trees and everything. So it's just like, and later on, when you hear this, Bill Alexander's upset because Bob Ross stole everything from me. So the question is, maybe that's the true story. Bob Ross really did steal everything from him and go and create whatever was created. Or, like you say, it's like a package that's been presented, a particular package, and it was actually given to Bob Ross. They felt, well, Bill Alexander's done his job. Now it's time for Bob Ross to do his. I don't know. I'll leave it there. Let Michael start from there for me.
So can I just respond to
yeah.
So a couple of things. So what you just said, though, like it's kind of like when they update Star Wars with like multiracial characters because they've decided that that's better for this generation, right? Like a period of time where Bill Alexander's tone was like productive for whatever the purpose that they were after was, like that had come to an end, and then they decided this more hypnotic thing was it. Right? It's kind of like, and Michael and I talk about this a lot in what we do, like there was a very violent or torturous kind of mind control that was being used in the 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And then in the 70s and 80s, it switched to this more like sort of hypnotic, drugged out, trance-like kind of thing that wasn't as like, easier for a person to love their mind control than when they're being tortured, or when they're being like directly commanded at. Now, even though Bill Alexander was positive, it was a more commanding presence as opposed to like the hypnotic kind of thing. So I think that came, especially if it happened in the early 80s at a time when we had decided that like hypnotic trance was the way to go rather than like pounding an idea in. It reminds me of like I was a gymnast.
But that's Bob Ross too, right? Because Bob, in that article, in any article, Bob Ross talks about his days in the Air Force, how he hated that he was the guy that had to make people scrub the latrines, and he's the guy who had to make you do this, and he was always known for barking orders at people. Well, that would sum into what you just said, and then all of a sudden there's a shift. Bob Ross is now no longer that. Bob Ross is now this calm, relaxing presence. So that just ties into what you just said. I'll shut up now.
No, perfect. All right,
Michael.
All right. Fascinating observations, Howdie. And that last exchange, that was great. So this was a fun one. This was a tricky one. I'm in agreement with you, Emily, like, you know, how it made me feel and like how I wanted to approach it, all sorts of different things. So, and I also feel very similar to you in the fact that this does not feel very well organized, but I think that's kind of the nature of what we're doing here for the folks at home. Like, you know, we're jumping in, we don't have much time to really think it out. So it's kind of like, you know, that's half the fun of this High Wire Act. So I'm going to take, whereas I am very much in alignment with you in the point of my presentation, like this is mind control. And my fakeness of this is a little bit, less spectacular, let's say, than being CGI, though. I think that's a really interesting idea about, like, you know, we're always 50 years behind. But I'm looking at it more so as the mythos. And this article is a demoralization hit piece. You know, regardless if Bob Ross is a real person or not, like that's what this is. So it's like you got all like the vaccine stuff and you got like all of the Gaza stuff. And then you're given this character and you got to look at it generationally. Like, so you've got like, you know, the baby boomer crowd, which has a certain feel because they were a certain age when Bob Ross was introduced. You got the Generation X community, which is like, you know, it's a little bit different. They see him more as like, you know, a funny guy as opposed to actually like, you know, tying in. And then you got like the later generations, the millennials, where he's just like a meme, like, oh, I didn't even realize he was a real friggin' Bob Ross. I just thought he was a symbol of like what the 80s or the 70s look like. So this is a deconstruction and a demoralization, primarily, I think, at Generation X, but like also baby boomer of this Bob Ross guy. And so what the demoralization is, and it's all part of like the movement of I mean, whereas cancel culture is the most in your face experience of like what's going on right now, where you take down one reality, one narrative to introduce another, like, you know, the time old process, like, you know, this fits in with it very much so. And so like what the demoralization is like this Bob Ross character who was kind of like what Howdie was talking about, like this, the ability, like where characters and stories are like, you know, they're created. And so from the individual level, when we watch a star, when we watch something like, you know, this becomes like a mythological character, particularly in the style which Bob Ross was introduced, like a very, very strong archetypical around a certain way, happy trees and everything is great, almost like a joke. Like, could this be real? Like, you know, is this really happening? And it's almost the opposite of what they did with Mr. Rogers in the Mr. Rogers movie, but that's a different thing. So what they're doing is they are destroying this image which everyone holds in the background of, like, you know, the perfect Bob Ross character. It's like finding out like your beloved grandfather was like, you know, a Satanist or something like that. You know, it's, oh shit, I didn't even know. And it's on the background, like it's not really serious, like, because he's just a symbol. But that's how like the mind control kind of works. And how you're describing, like how they would hit you with all of these disparaging key words or ideas throughout the story. Like, yeah, that's how like you work on these deeper levels of the mind. And who's also going to read the story? Who's going to sit down and read a 12,000 word story, but also probably someone who falls underneath the intellectual demographic of your PBS watcher. So it's like, it's all kind of fitting in together with that. So you've got this destruction of the mythos of Bob Ross, And what it's also a revelation of the method, a mea culpa. And they're like, I'm telling you exactly how this is being done. Like, yeah, this guy is, no matter how you see it, he's squeezed between the Nazis and the Rockefellers, right? You know, or the Nazis and the CIA, when it's all Rockefeller. Like, they all go back through that. This is all part of it. These are the same central characters. It's about like money and it's deceit and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, you know, it's the breaking down of the story so I can go and create new mythos. Like, you know, that's what's kind of going on and they're showing it. So all that being said, where I really jumped into was because I like spacing. And I agreed with you about like that very early on in the article where they start mentioning locations. Mm-hmm. And the location which I'm going to zero in on is where it said the 402 episodes were filmed from, and it was Muncie, Indiana. And mm-hmm. Muncie, Indiana, because it's so linked to this, is like, you know, this is the spiritual, this is the spiritual grounding. This is where we're literally putting this, you know, this magic, as you put out, like the magic of the magic white, where they're right. grounding it into material reality. So I pulled together a couple slides, and let me see. They're not really well organized, so I'm gonna have to walk through this, and it's taking a little bit of moment. Okay, here we go. Is that no?
Thank you for making them not well organized.
That was okay. So my computer's going. It's really weird. In the last 2 days, all of my technology has changed.
Well, there was a big geomagnetic storm, right? The other day that seemed, we were having issues with that too. There was apparently a huge, and I'm not saying that that's a real story. It's probably a cover for something else, but it seemed to coincide with that. We were having
all right.
As well.
So let's see if this works. Okay. Did this did this show up on the screen?
Yep.
Text.
Yep.
Okay, good. Okay. So let's begin here. So just like what you're saying, like, you know, he's Bob Ross is in the squeeze between the Nazi and the CIA guy. So we know all that. And is this where it talks about? So this is where it says right here. This was the year 1978 after deployment in no, it's here it is. Nor does it begin in the backwaters of Muncie, Indiana, where almost 403 episodes of his international smash hit were filmed. We also have tied in Orlando and Disney World, like all of the key places. So let's go a little bit deeper. So it's going to be a little bit out of order, but this jumped out at me in looking at the history of Muncie. And we're going to get into that. We're going to look at this first from from this one. It's right by this town called Eaton. And so Muncie was established, I think, in like the 1850s. And then it says it's linking it to this town Eaton right here in this one article. And it says that natural gas, a very large natural gas pocket, is underneath this part of the world. And when it first was lit in Eaton, Muncie became the much larger city, and we'll understand why. The flames were visible this 10 miles away. And after a brief investigation, it was decided that they had breached the ceiling of hell. So this is the Wikipedia story, like, you know, so now we're kind of linking about where we're grounding this energy. And, you know, they're saying from the very beginning, we're calling it hell. And then this was like from a story I found. Let's see. And it's talking about the history of Muncie. And what I want to point out is the similarity of what you're saying. Muncie has become known as the El Dorado of the West, the magic city, and the home of the industrial genie. So now we've got like more and more and more of this like linking of like this land where all this stuff was filmed with, like, you know, hell and jinn and like magic and mystical cities and all this sort of stuff. So we've got that right there. So where does Muncie get its actual name? So the history which we're given is that let me pull that down here. All right, so I don't think I pulled that up. So I'm just going to tell you where Muncie gets its name. So Muncie gets its name from a clan, one of the families of the Lenape people, or the Delaware people, who were, if you're familiar with Ross Ben's work, this is who he's always talking about, like the peoples who were living in Philadelphia and who got like the shaft in all of the in the treaties. And so the Muncie, which was the wolf clan of the Lenape people, were then forced, or they moved further west when their land in now current Pennsylvania is had been taken over, and this is where they settled. And so they settled here. So for whatever reason, so imagine, like, for whatever the reason would be, like, of all of this place, like, it wasn't said like they were given a reservation. It was like, this is where they went west and this is where they settled. They settled in this area, and then eventually it was taken over with the expansion, or at least what we're told of is the expansion of the East. So it ties in very much to the Lenape people and all of the lore and the history that goes along with that. But and we could spend a whole hour just talk about that, but we want to move on because this is where Muncie gets really, really interesting. So Muncie, it became like a big boom town. One of the primary manufacturers in Muncie in the late 1800s was the Baal, Ball glass company. And if you're familiar with like canning or anything like that, like there are really only two companies that make glass jars for canning: Mason jars and Baal jars. So we've got like this obvious like Masonic link, and now we've got Baal worship. And so the Baal family, they originated from the founding of Newark, New Jersey. And then if you look at the history of the Baal family, they're continually founding universities, which I found interesting. And we're seeing like, this is a big family. Baal University is located in Muncie, Indiana. But that's not where I want to go with. So Muncie, Indiana became really well known in the late 20s and early 30s. First off, and this is, again, like Muncie is so friggin' rich. Muncie seemingly was like, I know that they have a very, very strong history tied to the Ku Klux Klan. And what I found only in one place is it said it was because they were the national headquarters, like in the 20s. Regardless, like the Klan and everything that the Klan symbolizes is tied in very much in the mythos of Muncie and the land of Muncie. And again, we're beginning to see like also the Lenape people. So we're dealing with divisions of humanity. Like that's really what we're seeing at the underlying of like all of the Rockefeller stuff and all of the demoralization and the breakdown of the cancel culture to bring a new one, because it's all from the basis of like this like creating rifts between like, everyday people from other everyday people. Like that is like, that is a big modus operandi. And these like, the cancel culture isn't to like make it right. It's just like, oh, we're exposing the one lie. So to Howdie's point about like the real story of like, let's say Bob Ross is a real person and all of that's real, the real story. It's like, it's showing you like, underneath all of the glamour is still like, the same deceit. And there's a certain truth in cancel culture, but it's never to get to like the deeper level. It's just that you stay in that reality. It's just a revolution. The wheel just changes. So we're seeing that being revealed. So what Muncie is best known for, there was a sociological study published in 1930 called Middletown. And Middletown was the first of its kind, the Middletown study. And I'm just going to talk about it. I could go through these different points, but I think that'll take too long. The Middletown study was about these two people, the Lynns, a husband and wife team who spent 18 months. They picked Muncie as the most like average Midwestern study to understand life of humanity. This is anything but the most average city, because like just like 10 years later, like Muncie was like known throughout the nation of all of their Klan connections, and it was a big controversy at the time. So like that right there, that story, like Muncie was selected, and these are two people who were not sociologists. It wasn't until after the study that they got these honorary degrees and are recognized as like the key, like the greatest symbols of sociology, because the study which they did changed everything. Like it's like the Flexner brothers, and they were all funded by the Rockefellers. And how the story goes is they wrote like kind of like a negative story or article, or published a study or something about the Rockefellers. And then the Rockefellers like, hey, we like your work, we're going to fund you. And what we want you to do is go and study this changing of tide of American life. Now, mind you, this is the 1920s. And so the point of the article was all about the point of the study, excuse me, was all about how American society moved from agrarian to industrial, and was talking about changes in American life during this change. Just like right now, as we're moving to this next version from like industrial to like, the fourth industrial revolution, as they call it. Same thing, it's all linked with this. This is part of like the demoralization, the taking down of the story. And we see this is where Muncie went on the map. So then you go and you see that this book was huge, and from that, the Linds were able to go and they were heralded as like intellectual experts. Like this is all again the same values of the PBS crowd, like academic rigor and academic prestige and stuff like that. And they went through Columbia University, Rockefeller University, and then for the next 50 years or so, they kept going back to Middletown and looking at all of the studies. I haven't even told you what they studied about, but the point I'm trying to make is we see this continuity now of studying people throughout life, to seeing the change, to understand how change works so they can better apply it. You and I have talked about this a lot, Emily, about the town which I grew up in, Columbia, Maryland, was a Rockefeller-funded town. And my guess in reading this is like it was the next level of part of the experimentation based upon what was learned, particularly as in Muncie. So what the Muncie or the Middletown, it wasn't until later that after this research paper was, I think, a 500-page book, which was like really, really popular within the intelligentsia of America at the time. It like it showed like the change of American family life, and this idea of middle America being this wonderful thing. They said, no, that's not the case. It is strife with class warfare and racial inequities. And it was a demoralization story or study. It basically said that dream which you had of what the American Midwest small town was, that ain't so. It's filled with shit. Just in the same way, Bob Ross. Oh, Bob Ross is this happy person. You're like, oh, this is who I strive to be. I want to be such at peace with life. Oh no, he was absolutely tortured and in constant embattlement. So it's like this demoralization, and that helped move and really set the stage for then what would become like the baby boomers, where that generation, when they stepped into adolescence, like they really were part of the deconstruction of what like the perfect 1950s family looked like. And this beginning of this Middletown study was that this is the beginning of that national introduction of demoralization meme. That's what it is. This is what the literal definition of a meme, of like a contagious mind idea. In a very similar way, I would say, Howdie, as well as like, the introduction of ideas were done to the same class in the expositions. That class 30 years later is who's reading this research study. So that being said, I'm going to conclude this presentation with some pictures. All right, because we like buildings. We're going to look at this. So this was the first Freemasonic building in Muncie. And then they built this one supposedly 30 years later. We've got these half windows right there. And you're like, okay, why does this town of 30,000 need both of these Masonic temples? You asked me. So we got that going on. So this right here was the Muncie courthouse. This was supposedly built in 1887. and they tore it down in 1966 in order to build this courthouse, because you know how this makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. There's your visual ASMR for you, Howdie. Like this, when you look at it, this architecture, you feel a certain way, and then they give you this instead. And so this isn't the only thing. So right here, this is the Muncie Library, said to be constructed in 1906 by a grant given by the Carnegie Foundation. But then this is the new Muncie Library, this little atrocity. And this houses so much in this of a lot of this Muncie history, particularly all of the research which was done on this Middleton study, and then also the Baal family. This is Baal University. Everything is Baal worship here, and Baal University, which began as a defunct, what they called normal school or teacher school. Then the Baal Foundation turned it into a research center. So it's a research college. And in the middle of all this, to show the gratitude that the school has to the Baal family, is that they built this structure right in the middle, right here in Ball State University in Muncie. And the angel in the center is known as the angel of the waters. So again, we've got more water worship symbology.
Yeah.
And so with that, I think I'm going to conclude my portion of the presentation. I hit on a whole bunch of different stuff, and I'd be interested to hear any sort of comments.
Howdie, I think you're up.
Me first, okay. Interestingly, while you were presenting all of that information, two things I thought of. First, where was Dave Letterman from? Was he from Muncie, Indiana?
He may very well be. He's definitely from Indiana.
Yeah, he's definitely from Indiana. I actually thought he might be from Muncie. So while you're talking, you can quickly see where he was born.
Okay.
The second was when a lot of what you're talking about with this Middleton study and the presentation of things, it made me think of the movie Pleasantville. Actually, the movie, which has so many different layers to it, which not only sort of, in one sense, it looks like they're poking fun at 1950s sort of family life and culture of the 1950s, but of course, really, the movie is about the breaking of the bubble, the breaking of this idea of reality is just a description, and the people in Pleasantville only know one reality, and once this external force breaks in, they're presented a completely different reality, and it's about dealing with the expansion of possibility, right? And so I would be curious to look back now at this study and see what were they really studying.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Like I only just started looking at this like maybe about an hour or so before we got on this call. And I was like really wanting to go deep into that. I've got a personal connection in growing up in planned communities. I'm like, this is where they're getting a lot of their initial, it's the same foundations, it's the same stuff. And this is probably where they got a lot of their primary research. And you are correct about David Letterman being connected to Muncie, Indiana. He went to Ball State.
Yes.
So he grew up in Indianapolis, or he was born there, but he had his education. And it's interesting if you think about like Dave Letterman and like his role, or even just the overall role of what the late night talk show host does to a particularly in the time of the 80s and 90s before like their role of mental magician on certain demographics.
Go look at the Bill Alexander's smile and look at David Letterman's smile. That's disturbing, just for a little light shit and giggle.
And Dave always had this, like his style was, he had this rage that seems to be roaring beneath his very, very calm demeanor. And like, that was half the fun. And that seems to be a lot of like the Bill Alexander story as well. Like, you know, he's got this very, very like pleasant demeanor, but there's this rage that's underneath the surface, like the fire beneath these natural gas pockets beneath Muncie.
Yeah. All right. Did you have anything else, Howdie?
Oh, that's good.
All right. So I'm going to, lots of things came up for me while you were talking, but I'm going to skip over like the obvious parts about like, you know, this questions, you know, this was sandwiched between the propaganda about vaccine and Gaza, and both the issues of the vaccine and the Gaza-Israel thing come down to like identity and who owns what, right? Who owns your body, who's the rightful owner of those lands and whatnot. But this story touches on some of that same stuff. Also, like there was some stuff in some of the things I looked at about Mr. Rogers, Captain Kangaroo, Richard Simmons, Bob Ross as all being different types for different kinds of sort of mind control. And then there's another famous Walt, of course, Walt Disney was a propagandist, right? And then we have Walt Kowalski here, who seemed to be a minister of propaganda maybe for the CIA. But I'm going to skip over all of that and go to, at the risk of looking like a bigger lunatic than I already probably look like sometimes, I'm going to have you pull back up that map of Muncie. Can you pull back up that map of Muncie? And by the way, the only other thing that I've heard my father get excited about over the course of the last year is a Dodger player named Max Muncie. Our real estate agent here was Max Muncie's roommate. And when my dad heard that, he got all excited. Right? Max Muncie is a player on the Dodgers. So already as soon as we get to Muncie, my mind is clicking about stuff. But okay, so here we go. Now, this is just, and I don't know if I can clarify this in a way that makes sense. Michael, you and I have talked about this. But when I'm looking at the way reality is made up or our lives, I'm starting to see people's history or biography, and sometimes even their names, is some sort of cipher or code for figuring out reality here. But what I'm seeing when I look at this here, right, this is your thing about Muncie. Well, I grew up right next to DeSoto. You could take DeSoto down the street to Woodland Hills, which was right next to Canoga Park. My teacher in preschool's name was Mrs. Eaton, right? I have a friend named Laura Gaston. Also, last week when I was in Dallas, the hotel I stayed at was on Gaston. Right before I got on with you guys, I was watching a video about the Gaza-Israel thing from somebody named Scott Anthony. And my grandfather's name is Monroe Middleton, right? Middleton. He's from Pennsylvania. You were just talking about Middletown, Pennsylvania, right? Middletown study. Then I looked over here and for some reason my mind was pulled towards Selma. And I was thinking, Selma, what famous happened in Selma? Was there something that we covered the other day about Tina Turner in having to do with Selma? So I realized later that maybe my Selma thing had to do with Martin Luther King. He had something happen in Selma, right? But for some reason, my mind went to Tina Turner. So I look up Selma, Tina Turner, right? Because Michael and I did a show about Tina Turner the other day. And the first article that comes up is Oprah Winfrey had an out-of-body experience when she shared the stage with Tina Turner. Then the next thing that comes up is an article about a historical hotel in Selma that's about to be refurbished. And the article is written by student reporter Tina Turner, right? Do you want to know what what the hotel is that was refurbished in Selma?
What? Lorenzo.
St. James.
St. James, that would be number 2.
Coming up over and over for Michael and I, right? So it's like, I made a mistake, but I ended up back circling to topics that we have been talking about, right? Like, so everything on this map. Oh, also there's a restaurant I used to eat at in Los Angeles called Granville Cafe, right? Okay, and Tina Turner's mother's name was Zelma, not Selma. So like, I'm at the risk of looking completely like John Nash and like a total lunatic, how is it that like, right, just looking at this little picture right here around this Muncie thing elicits so much? The biggest one for me though, was that my grandfather's Middleton name was Middleton. And of course he was born in the 20s. Right. And he's from Middletown. He's from that area of Pennsylvania, Middletown. I don't know what any of this means. Oh, and also Wheeling, West Virginia. There was a girl on my gymnastics team that was from Wheeling, West Virginia. And I went there randomly one time. Right. So all the stuff which is within the picture that you're choosing to show us in relation to this article about Bob Ross, which seems to be a mishmash of stuff that is like just layers of mind control to trigger anybody whose particular thing is one of those things. Like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah, like, I mean, as we begin looking at that, as what's so fascinating about this exercise, which the three of us are doing, is seeing what's being pulled out and how it like kind of the self affirmation and confirmation of what we're looking at, and all of it has like very, very deep meaning, but in completely different ways.
And then the last thing I'll say is that
one more thing. I would say this: Muncie's at exactly the 40th parallel. It's 40.1 when you do it that way. I'm on the exact same latitudinal line.
Of course.
Of course.
Of course, right? And then the last thing I'll say is you were talking about the Ku Klux Klan and this Muncie being an area where they talk about social science and change. Well, like my family, my sister and my dad are deep in that conversation about races. Everybody's racist and canceling and all of that kind of stuff, right? You also talked about the Baal Glass Company, right? But another way of saying Baal glass is glass bead, right? Like, I don't know, we've been playing the glass bead game, right? So it's just like, I don't know what all of this stuff means. And then you were showing us these buildings and how they went from being these ornate Tartarian buildings to these things that just look like computer servers, right? And when I've talked about when I'm starting to look at downtown Austin and other places, how all of these buildings that are being constructed look like pieces of technology. Well, I would say that maybe those buildings, that library, the buildings themselves are servers where the deeper information from the studies are actually stored. Like if you read Coup de 12 by David Martin, he talks about what happened to the buildings on 9/11 had to do with like what they were made of. And he talked about like certain like building materials being used to store information to a certain extent. And that comes up over and over when you look into Tartaria and all of this kind of stuff. Like, were these buildings technologies? Right. And that was more ornate and beautiful. And now we have just these like functional kinds of things. But that library looks like a stack of computer servers to me.
I would agree.
So anyway.
All right. Howdy, you're up.
Okay. Well, like we talked about earlier, it's interesting to go last to hear what everyone's talking about. And I had a few different things to say. And I can just, I think, give a short overview of just a couple of things and then just let us converse to end rather than present a whole lot more information. Because I had stuff on what ASMR is, which is, how Bob Ross is tied into that, but which is such a strange thing. I mean, go watch some videos on YouTube and whatever that is. I mean, so there's that's a whole field you can look into if you want. I didn't want to go there. When Michael just mentioned Angel of the Waters, the statue in Muncie, if one thing I found is that the Air Force base that Bob Ross is supposed to have been stationed at in Alaska, it was called Eielson Air Force Base. Right next to it is a lake, and it's known as the Lady of the Lake. Now, the Lady of the Lake, it's given that name because it's supposed to be the last B-29 bomber or something that took off in the States or something in wartime or whatever, crashed and is in this lake. I didn't go into the complete story, but it was just the Lady of the Lake is just a really weird thing to label a crashed B-29 bomber. So I thought that's weird in itself. And it almost sounds like it's a magic lake. The Lady of the Lake, as if there's like, Isis or Diana or something, that it's like you're talking about some sort of magic location. I also, when I looked into the Air Force Base, and you can look into it yourself sometime, there's a lot of stuff on this Air Force Base that I never thought would be on an Air Force Base. Like, there's a university, Wayland Baptist University. There's, it's got like, it's just bigger and more complete than I ever thought. No, okay, you said, well, it's in Alaska or something. They need to.
What's the name of the base? What's the name of the base?
I think it's called, if I spell it out for you, it's called, it's called EIELSON.
Okay.
So EIELSON Air Force Base in Alaska. So anyways, the base itself, it's just south of Fairbanks. I've been to Fairbanks once a long time ago, and which was an interesting city to say the least. But yeah, it was definitely odd. It was definitely odd. So, okay. The next thing I thought about was going, because like I said, I watched Bob Ross. Like I say, actually watched his painting show. And there were two phrases that I thought we should just bring up that maybe you guys will want to talk about later on for those who didn't watch it as closely as I did. That is, whenever he would clean his paintbrush, whenever he had to clean the paintbrush, he would always say he's beating the devil out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Just beat the devil out. Just beat the devil out. He had this, and that was he makes that was in every show. He talked about how much fun that was to beat the devil out of his paintbrush. So that was one comment that people. The other was he always wanted to refer to his paintings as a magical world, and that kind of like it's your world. You put in here whatever you want. How many trees you want, how many mountains you want. It's your world. It's kind of like he's triggering your imagination of possibility almost in what he's saying and reminding you it's your world, right? It's your world. And then the third piece is just about Bob that I always remembered was he never painted people. So people were never in his paintings. Animals, he might have put a couple of birds in once or twice, but I never recalled an animal in his paintings. And only once or twice he would paint like a cabin. There would be like a small log cabin every once in a while, but still there was no presence of people. It was just the nature. Now, of course, somebody could say he just wants to paint unblemished nature as if he's painting the world before people got here. One could say that, or one could say something else. But that's just the things that came up as my memory of some Bob Ross type things. The last thing that I'll mention before we just open it up, so again, I don't take too much time, and that is the painting technique itself. And then I'll share my screen in a second. And the painting technique is known as wet on wet, where you start with a wet canvas and then you apply wet paint to it so that things can be easily blended and done, but you have to paint very quickly. Now, this painting style, granted, Bill Alexander, you might say, perfected a particular type of wet on wet that we think of, but really this is an older painting style that seems to have been created in the 14th or 15th century, particularly in Belgium, in the Danish-controlled Belgium of Flanders. And this was the part where people like Rembrandt, a number of different people used this wet on wet method in their painting back then. So when I thought about Flanders a little bit, two specific things came up, and I guess I'll just share my screen first. Am I sharing it? Is it working? Maybe not.
Yeah, it's working.
My screen up? Yeah. So one of the first things when you think of as Flanders is this. This was a main battle area in World War I, right? This is where the battles of like Ypres and Passchendaele and everything else were fought. We're right along the Belgian front. So this sort of mud and total destruction is Flanders. This is the First World War, and this is the later origin of the wet on wet painting technique. I'll show some more wet on wet for people later on, but okay, so we got World War I. But what was before World War I? One of the places you can still get an idea of what was before World War I is to go to the town of Leuven, Belgium. I'm not sure if it's exactly in Flanders, but it's a really good. I never knew when I was studying all these buildings how many old, fantastic buildings Belgium has. Like, there's a reason that the United Nations, or not the EU, wants to be in Belgium.
Yep.
Right. There's a reason for that. Here's the town hall in Leuven, Belgium. That is like the town hall of the town square. Like, think of the construction of this. Here's another side. You can see it from the side. That's one building in Leuven, in this not rather large city in Belgium. Let's look at some other things that you can find in Belgium, in Leuven, Belgium. Well, how about this city? How about this building right here? I believe it's like a university or some sort of important building. All right. Because it was on my list, my pre-coronavirus list of things I wanted to see was these really wild sites in Leuven, Belgium. What is this? This is a specific Catholic university in Leuven, Belgium. Look at this thing. So we've got this also. This and I found this all through Leuven, all through parts of Belgium when I was thinking of where to go look next. And it told me that Belgium had a way more important, Belgium and the Netherlands was a way more important part of the world than we ever thought. Mm-hmm. because of and it's a lot of that is still there. It hasn't been taken down. Now, if we look at wet on wet, I got to do Flanders painting, but you can just see some paintings like like this is a famous wet on wet here. I believe this is a Rembrandt, just so you can get an idea. So you can, when you're used to looking at Bob Ross wet on wet paintings, well, this is also the wet on wet technique. And this is, I believe it's a Rembrandt, yeah. So just trying to give you an idea that wet on wet is not something that Bob Ross or Bill Alexander, did. They just perfected it in a particular way. So I don't want to go into too much of that. I'll take off the sharing here when I figure out how to do that. Stop share. There we go. So I just wanted to sort of allow us now to have this kind of conversation of wherever you think it wants to go, where I want to take it a little bit to potentially different places. One is the way what Bob Ross was communicating in the shows, what he was doing, why he was so popular. That's one way of because he was really popular. I mean, he was on for 15 years or something, and for PBS, other than Sesame Street, probably Bob Ross was their number 2 program, you'd think. And then it's the wet on wet, and its relation to this part of Belgium, and the fact that this part of Belgium then later on became the prime battleground of World War I. So I just thought I'd leave that and let you guys discuss what comes into your mind from that.
Who's going first?
You have some. I got something. If you don't have something,
I got plenty. But if you go ahead, and
I'll start with just one thing. So what I think is interesting is, I'm kind of gravitated to like the psychological demoralization. That's a very big part of like group mind control, and you're the whole idea of if anyone knows what wet on wet painting is, chances are maybe they might know it through Bob Ross, and like what it's really like a bastardization of like what it once was. And, you linked it to Flanders. So when you were talking about Flanders, I immediately think of Ned Flanders. I think of like from The Simpsons. And so what's interesting about that is Springfield is very similar to Middletown in the study, because Middletown was presented like they were saying, like, we're not telling you the real town we studied, we're just calling it Middletown, and it's like, everyday mid-sized city in the Midwest, which Springfield kind of falls in it. And Ned Flanders is also like kind of like what was deconstructed. They're making fun of, like, he's supposedly everything is it would be perfect, but like underneath him is also these, like, all of these like rage and passion and all of this stuff which shows up every once in a while. So I thought that was an interesting like parallel to what you're showing with the wet on what, and what Flanders and that part of Belgium actually is and points to.
Yep. Emily?
All right. So first of all, I can confirm that he never painted animals, because in that weird article that was like the squirrel Twilight language, MK triggering for old people like my dad or whatever, it said in there, it was very bizarre because Peapod was Bob Ross's favorite little pocket squirrel, but somehow he never painted him because he never painted animals. He didn't ever paint anything like that we think of as like sentient or whatever it is, right?
Right.
No, not at all. So I can confirm that for you. And what you were talking about just like creating a magic world, it's like that would be, so if he was the precursor or the early version of CGI, those magic worlds were like the precursor to like the Second Life, right? Which is like you create your own world in this online gaming kind of thing, right? Where you can literally create whatever world you want, right? So that was kind of when you're in the painting, this is just your magic world and blah, 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 right? The other thing is when I have these weird moments where reality looks kind of fake to me, like there's this one, when we go to Palm Springs, when you're driving around near Palm Springs, you look off into the distance and you see the nature and it looks like a painting. And you have that thought for a moment. I'm like, am I in a real world or is this a painting? Right. But when you're looking at that, you're just looking at the nature. It's like, it's a different landscape because it's desert than what he really painted. Right. But it has this, like, you feel like you're driving into some kind of painting or simulation or something like that. It doesn't look real. So something about like, doing something to our minds to create these magic worlds. I don't know. That's part of what sort of came up for me. And then the next thing is where I went, as soon as you started talking about wet on wet, my mind went to wet works, right? And it would be interesting. And wet works, of course, are parts of political assassinations where blood is spilled, right? I looked up just to be clear what the definition of wet works is, and it says wet work is a euphemism for a murder or assassination that alludes to spilling blood. So it would be interesting to go back and to look and see, like, if one could find a calendar of the tours where his workshops went to see if any kinds of strange deaths occurred while that tour was in town, right? Any kind of strange political, like, characters off or something else, whatever. If there was other weird things going on in the town the same time that Bob Ross's painting workshop was there, right? Because they made a big deal about this wet on wet thing, right? So I'm looking at it from that example, but nobody would ever think, oh my God, there was a murder in town. There was also a Bob Ross.
Bob Ross did it.
Right? Like Bob Ross, and especially if there's multiple people playing Bob Ross, you could have one Bob Ross at the workshop while the other Bob Ross was doing, or Walt Kowalski or whatever, right? So to me, the wet on wet was somehow a code for wet works.
I have no idea what the real story of this is. It's just a reminder that once you start dissecting reality, and this is, I'm going to take where you just went. Once you start dissecting any piece of this reality, it doesn't matter what you choose to dissect, it turns out to be fake.
Yeah.
Right. So it doesn't matter whether you want to look at people, events, stories, nature, anything. Once you begin to see that everything that's in your senses, what you see, what you hear, what you touch, everything that seems external to you is false. It's actually not true. Mm-hmm. How it's not true and how it's false, each person will have to dig into that of what that means for themselves. But it is quite clear that it is definitely, for sure, not what you think you're experiencing. We can at least say that safely. And so, for me, one of the things of this whole, our talk today, and even my look into Bob Ross and the sort of presentation he was making, which again was this kind of, it was a magical world that was happening there every half an hour in its own way. This painting was like a magical creation because he did it in 22 minutes. It was like, that was usually what used to just blow my mind. There's white on the canvas, 22 minutes later, it's that, and he made it feel like I could do that. It's like, you know what? I have no artistic skill whatsoever, but I think I could do that. If I actually spent a month, I bet you I could do that too. So it was also this weird, encouraging pulling into which on one level, I think that's positive. I'm sure that inspired a lot of people over the course of their lives to try, whether it's painting or singing or playing the piano or whatever. Then there's this second layer of what this whole thing might be. And for me, it's also the sense of seeing it's a manufactured reality. Everything on television is a manufactured reality, everything on movies. But when you look out your window or you look out your front door, that's a manufactured reality. And as long as people are really holding on to this thing is real around me, you're missing half of the spiritual journey. Half of the spiritual journey is having to dissect who we are and where we are. And step one is always, I'll just stop here. I'll shut up and let you talk. But of course, I have people that I work with, hi, Laura. But there's one gentleman who feels compelled to help people and help the world. And it's just a driving compassion that he has. And I haven't got to the point yet of having to ask him, have you proved that there is a world and that there are people to help? So many things are taken at a foundational level without having been tested for their trueness or not. And so for me, a lot of this talk today is wanting to share that as well, that no matter what story you're going to look, no matter what avenue you're going to take down, you're always going to be seeing somewhere the falseness of this thing we call the world. Go ahead, guys.
All right. And I like how we kind of how you turned a corner in the conversation right there, Howdie. And I want to run with that a little bit too. So you asked the question at the end of the main part of your presentation. It was like, what is Bob telling us? And so you brought up, like, you know, on that like kind of grandiose level is like, you know, this is part of the fake, like, and it, which fits in very much like what I'm talking about, like the demoralization, the breaking down, the cancel culture. It's like, well, on a bigger picture, it's all what you're saying. So, but you also mentioned, you said on the higher level, or one level up, was he was very like inspiring, and he was inspiring you as a child to like, wow, I can do this. Like, you know, that I can do that. So I want to go back and look at specifically, because I like to get into like the details, like sitting at that level of reality where it does feel real. So what is, if all of this is seemingly like part of like a much deeper, like, and we'll say operation, but like what you're saying, like it's all fake. And there are some people who are pulling the strings of like the cultural fakeness. So what exactly did he do? Cause I did not watch Bob Ross. Like I was 10 years old in 9 years old in 1980. Like I never watched Bob Ross, but I knew who he was. So it was interesting to hear what your feedback was as someone who watched it. So, but what I am very good at is understanding like how you play like imagination in hypnotic games. And so when you say that there is no life in his landscapes and he's creating a certain type of, like, as you're watching it, like through the voice and through the continuity every week, it's exactly the same angles. And I speak the same way and I get drawn right in. Like that's very hypnotic. And he's creating a canvas, but he's not creating a blank canvas, but in a way he is. He's creating a blank canvas with a nature backdrop. So like, which is kind of funny, like when you're saying, like when you look out your window, like that's fake. Like it's just as fake as that. Like once you realize the fractal nature, it's like, it's the same fractal. And like, yeah, he is part of like the whole sort of like CIA military, or seemingly is part of the CIA military industrial complex, but he is a bright light within it. Like, you know, built in all of the shit is always still the gold. And so like, this is part of the gold. He is giving each person who has been a child, particularly with this style of hypnosis, meditation, whatever word you want to call it. Like I've just given you a blank canvas. There's no life in there so that you can project your undisturbed imaginatory images on there, which is the opposite of Uncle Walt Disney, who wants to capture the imagination that's filled with life so that your life is imbued upon the archetypes which we see in those. So what Bob Ross is really doing is he's creating, like, particularly for the children, I think that's who it's going to be most symbolic of. Like, you know, you're mesmerized like every 22 minutes. It's like he's giving you everything is possible. And I'm not, and like built into all of this is still this message of like, I'm not giving you any archetypes for you to project your reality on other than the archetype of nature itself.
Really interesting. First of all, the Walt Disney and the Walt Kowalski, right? The two names are always the same. But that's a really interesting thing. That's another avenue we can take. Is the people who are behind Bob Ross, are they wanting to do one thing with his paintings, that they are trying to do one thing with the show, and Bob Ross is actually, without anybody knowing it, actually producing something else in the show at the same time?
Yeah.
So you've got two completely, you've got like a negative angle and a positive angle at the same time in the show, and you're kind of being hit with both of them, and you're almost like yourself navigating the positive and the negative through a painting show.
Well, it almost turns him into like a Timothy Leary type of character. Right? Where you're like we have one idea of him, and then you take a deeper look at what he was actually doing with his work and what he was actually saying, like at certain points, and then what he was doing when he felt like he was being nudged by intelligence agencies, he would turn into this thing. Like it's this crazy kind of thing, but it's like there's multiple things baked into what we think is one cake, but it was really like a cake inside of a cake. You're a comparison to him with the ASMR, which is this really bizarre fad too, that is like a technological version of hypnosis, or, you know, it's like weird, like they'll have like an ASMR video of like listening to a cat eat raw fish and the noise that it makes with its tongue, or like a woman clicking her nails on the computer board or whatever. And these are things that people find like relaxing and putting them into a trance. So it is kind of like an early version of ASMR, which is super interesting. The number 22. It's interesting. I just watched
Ah.
a movie that it's not a very good movie, but the ideas presented in it were interesting, called 222, right? Like the time 222. But I'm curious about what happens in 22 minutes, right? So like I know from my own experiences with EMDR, sounds a little bit like ASMR, EMDR and exercise and things, that when you do right left motion, once you pass about 30 minutes, right, that you go into this place where both sides of your brain are online at the same time, and you can start to make sense of things in the same way that only normally happens during REM sleep. Right? It's like usually during the day, either one side of your brain or the other is online at a time, not both. And right left motion for a certain period of time, whether it's the hand thingies, buzzing in EMDR therapy, or exercise, produces that mental state. I wonder what 22 minutes of a certain repetitive activity or listening to something in a certain tone or looking at certain colors does. But then there's also this whole thing that like 22 minutes seems to be the length of like people's attention span for a lot of stuff. Right? Besides just obviously like sitcoms and stuff like that, people want to work on something, but if they haven't achieved success in like 22 minutes or whatever, like then they don't want to keep doing it, right? Like our current culture, and this is where like Bob Ross fits in, like you can accomplish your dreams in 22 minutes, right? As opposed to having to work at something for a long time over a period of time, right? So he's the type that would appeal to this current kind of culture. So that part is interesting and fascinating as well. But what you were saying about everything being fake, right? Like, I mean, that's kind of when I was trying to explain how, like, it was weird that the map that Michael put up, just I made all these connections right away, and how you and I were talking about before we started. It feels like our life, or the person that I think of as Emily, and the things that are in my mind or that I've experienced, they're just a collection of phrases and data that can be rearranged to create completely different pictures, right? And that is like what we think of is reality is just one arrangement of the code or data that is in our brain or that is made up of. So it does beg the question, is anything real? Is all that there is us and this blank thing, and it's whatever the coding in our mind fills it in with, right? And there's a million different ways you can rearrange that. But what I'm finding is no matter what I do at this point, and Michael and I have been demonstrating this over and over for over a year now, that any point we drill in on, right? Like anything, we can pick some random topic. It will somehow find its way to connecting to the topic we were talking about that seems completely separate from it a minute before, an hour before, the week before, or whatever. And everything seems to tie back together in this way that like, what the fuck is this? It looks like a board that, when they're trying to solve a crime and they make the board with all the things and the strings and the dots, like we can pick anything to talk about and it will connect to like other stuff, like what I did with that little Tina Turner St. James. I found another one that's even fucking weirder that I could tell you guys about. Maybe I will later. But like, I mean, it seems to me that what we think of as our life or the world out there is just the current arrangement of the ideas or codes we have in our mind projected in a different pattern outside of us, or what feels like outside of us.
That's a nice way to describe it. Yeah. Carlos Castaneda, he put in his book that the world is just a description. And that the description you've created is created in your mind as a story that's created in your mind, created through words more than images, which was part of the reason for learning to stop it, not the way people in meditation want to stop their mind so they can be quiet or peaceful or happy. It was, and that's what I did 20 years ago, was that concept of, if the world is somehow just related to my thought or my story or what's in my head, if I could stop my mind, if I actually stopped thinking, would the world change? Would the world continue in the same way if I didn't think? And once that happened, it just literally fell apart. That's like when I say I know the world is not real, I'm not saying it from a book. I mean, I'm saying that because, I found that out the hard way, that none of it is solid and real or even here at all. It's here because you might say me is, in a sense, projecting something of reality to hold it. But if I turn my mind off, like actually, if I stop thinking now, already reality, even the computer screen is starting to change.
Yeah.
Everything is altering because I'm not I'm not whole. There's not. It's like if you think of a hologram, right? A hologram needs two waves to be created, two sets of waves. So one set of waves, Swedenborg talked about it. Well, one set of waves comes from the universe, one set of waves comes from us. So as long as we're creating one of the waves, we're creating a physical experience of reality. But if we stop our wave, reality becomes really, really different.
I have to tell you, just while you were doing that for those few seconds, whenever you would do that and stop, my knees would start to feel weak. My legs would start to feel like they were like disintegrating or turning.
Yeah, if I did again, look right at you, of course it would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's weird, dude. All right. So
there you go.
Like,
here's where Bob Ross took us.
Yeah. All right.
Michael?
The problem with our conversations is like we mention something interesting and then we go into something else before we can respond. So it's like I want to say a bunch. I'll just
go
say
back,
this,
Michael. Tell you what you want.
The 22-minute thing I thought was an interesting observation, and I thought of. Are you familiar with what's called the Pomodoro Method or the Pomodoro technique?
No.
It's a technique which is about how to become effective. And so again, this fits into this whole idea of studying behavior, studying culture, studying society, and then applying those lessons in a very like organized, structured way. And so the Pomodoro Method means like you work for 20 minutes on something nonstop, completely focused, and then you take a 5-minute break, and then you do that again. And it's a whole system about how to become more effective. Like it's an organizational behaviorist kind of wet dream. But like that, and they call it the Pomodoro because of the red tomato kitchen timer. Like you would set it for 20 minutes and then you work and nothing will distract you. And then for 5 minutes, you got to do whatever you want. And that's been like the way people like it's been studied how you become more effective. But then when taking that a step back, looking at it in terms of like natural cycles of like what happens in reality. Why is 20 minutes this kind of like magic sort of time? Like what that cycle is in terms of in capturing the part of like what you're just talking about, like the mind that never stops. And it's like, if I know I can keep your mind to never stop, because I don't want you to disintegrate the world, if that may be the point. That was interesting. But then also, you mentioned it twice. You mentioned it once as it relates to like Bob Ross is the good guy, Bob Ross is the bad guy. And I was picturing it as like a stereo, the two things. And then as you describe we create one wave and then the universe, the outer wave and it's the same thing. So we're going back and forth of all of these symbols. And then it goes back to Emily, because you and I talk about this a lot, is like, what if like, the CIA's, they're the good guys, it's like, you're always given they're the good guys or the bad guys. And like the idea, which is put out by like Philip K. Dick, the type of fictional guy who wants to question reality, is like, well, the Adjustment Bureau is really the ones that are just keeping the game going. And so all of those sort of like, I feel like I've gone 360 degrees in feeling with all of our conversation of like good guy, bad guy, CIA. Oh no, they're actually pointing out the collapse of it all so we can see. So this was a wonderful journey for me. Thank you very much, both of you.
All right, I got one more for you, Michael, and you're going to like this. All right. So I've brought this up a couple of times recently, but when you were talking, it just made me think, well, wait a second. Wasn't there a movie called Memento where Guy Pearce, his memory reset every 21 minutes or 22 minutes or something like that?
Was that what it was? 22 minutes? It's a Christopher Nolan film.
I was just going to say, it's a Christopher Nolan film. So basically, Leonard is tracking down the man who raped and murdered his wife. The difficulty, however, of locating his wife's killer is compounded by the fact that he suffers from a rare, untreatable form of memory loss. So like this goes into wet works. Like if Bob Ross is going around killing people, but 22 minutes later, he can't fucking remember that he did it, right? I mean, I'm just being silly with this, but like if there's operations going on underneath it, and things are blocked out in 22-minute periods, right? Like literally 22 minutes later, people are not going to be remembering what they did 22 minutes before, and reality sort of resets and they start all over again. I mean, this is the formula for creating a completely, like, what does Fritz Springmeier call it? Like a total mind control, like, mind controlled slave assassin or whatever, right? Like, that's kind of fascinating. But yes, I thought you would like that was a Christopher Nolan film. So Memento, I'm pretty sure it was like 21 minutes or 22 minutes or something.
Well, I think we should actually, before anyone comments on this too early, is that I used the word, I just said 22 minutes because that's usually what a television program actually is, right? It's 22 minutes of program, 8 minutes of commercials. But of course, PBS never had commercials. So I think Bob Ross's shows actually went 27 or 28 minutes, just so that before somebody comments on this now, okay. I'm almost sure when I look up a Bob Ross video on YouTube, they're all about 26 or 27 minutes, just so everyone knows.
Okay, but even still, and I'm not sure if Memento was 21 or 22 or whatever, but this idea of resetting reality, which is what he's doing, because starting with the blank canvas, beautiful thing, next time again, blank canvas, making almost the same but slightly different, beautiful thing that's very similar to the cycle that Guy Pearce was going through in Memento. I had no idea that was a Christopher Nolan film, by the way. Yeah. So anyway, all right, guys, I think we can probably keep doing this forever.
We got 22 more minutes and then we'll forget we even started. And I would say this, Howdie, the flip side is the 22 minutes is probably like, that's what you try to go and you collapse reality every 22 minutes to begin again.
Maybe.
That's my homework assignment for the next 2 weeks, is to try to collapse my reality every 22 minutes, and I'll see what happens.
Wow. Cool.
All right. So I think that wraps this one up for us. Yeah. I don't know. If we want to do another round like this, I was thinking if we want to do another round, maybe we could move the focus of the stories to the sports realm or something like that, to like try something similar but different. If you guys are interested in doing that, we can talk about that possibility or not or whatever. But that was kind of coming to my mind yesterday as I got sad that this round was coming to an end. So let me know if you guys are interested in that at some point.
Or maybe some people in the comments will have an idea of what they'd like to see as the next round.
I like that. All right, let's do that. Let's add in a layer of randomness.
All right, let's do that. Maybe we should let other people pick our topics.
We'll figure out, like, maybe like once we're off camera, like we'll think around, but like an interesting way to like randomize, whether it's a person or a vote or something, like, we'll allow that to be dictated back to us.
Yeah.
I like that.
Figure something out.
We'll figure something out.
Howdy, remind people where they can find you before we go.
Howdy McCoskey Talks, and the very long YouTube or very long website. Just look for my name. It's the easiest way to find me.
All right, Michael.
Looking for the name Mikowski is not an easy name. I'm going to tell you that right now.
If you spell it correctly, it is.
That puts all of the. If I spelled it correctly, my life would have been completely different, like a long time ago. I can be found at the algorithm that'll bring you to me will be the Susquehanna Alchemy algorithm, which is another one of those words which people are like, dude, I can't ever find you. I don't know how to spell that word. SusquehannaAlchemy.com or on YouTube. Those are probably the two best places.
All right, and you can find me on YouTube or all normal social media at Emily Moyer, patreon.com/offplanetmedia, or emilycmoyer.com now. Skeleton website is up, needs some revision, but the website is up. Thank you, gentlemen. This has been delightful, and we'll see you guys next time. All right.